a soldier, Mr. Garrison. 2 wars. I was one of those secret guys in the Pentagon that supplies the military hardware, the planes, bullets, rifles, for what we call black operations. Black ops. Assassinations, coup d'etat, rigging elections, propaganda, psych warfare, and so forth. World War II, I was in Romania, Greece, Yugoslavia. I helped evacuate part of the Nazi intelligence apparatus just before the end of the war. We used those guys in the fight against the communists. In Italy, 48, we stole the elections. France, 49, broke the strikes. Overthrew Carino in the Philippines, Arbins in Guatemala, Mossadegh in Iran. We were in Vietnam in 54, Indonesia 58, Tibet 59. Got the Dalai Lama out. We were good. Very good. Then we get into the Cuban thing. Not so good. Set up all the bases for the invasion, supposed to take place in October 16th.
Carlos Marcello's war with the United States government came to a head in 1963. He wasn't just fighting prosecutors, he was fighting Robert F. Kennedy himself. When the Justice Department couldn't pin him down, RFK turned to deportation. In a move that felt more like a kidnapping than law enforcement, federal agents snatched Marcello off the streets of New Orleans and dumped him in Guatemala. Getting back into the United States nearly killed him. The details are murky, but Marcello later admitted a loyal friend saved his life on the way home. He came back bitter, humiliated, and burning for revenge. To anyone who would listen, Marcello swore he would get even with the Kennedys. He wasn't alone. By then, the mob's relationship with the CIA ran deep. It started in the 1940s, when US intelligence leaned on gangsters to protect the docks from Nazi sabotage and grease the invasion of Sicily. After the war, the alliance grew stronger. Washington needed help pushing back communists across Europe. The CIA funneled money through mob channels, teaming with Corsicans, old fascists, and black marketeers to break strikes and bankroll the Marshall Plan. By the 1950s, the lines were gone. Organized crime and American intelligence worked hand in hand. The mob's reach was everywhere, at the IRS, inside narcotics squads, even in foreign governments. Waxy Gordon and Vito Genovese got taken down in part because rivals had federal muscle in their corner. But the facade began to crack. The public got its first real look inside the mafia with the Appalachian bust and the bloody murder of Albert Anastasia. Deportation became the government's favorite weapon, and the lesson was clear. Look at Lucky Luciano. Once the most powerful boss in America, reduced to exile, dying of a heart attack in Naples in 1962. Marcello knew he was next. The Kennedys made him a target from day one. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, pushed foreign governments to take him. Italy, Tunisia, France. Each refused. Rumors spread that Washington offered bribes to make it happen. None of it worked. Marcello stayed. Then came November 22nd, 1963. As Marcello fought his deportation case in court, John Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas. Marcello walked out of the courtroom victorious, his enemy gone. The Mafia's war with the White House seemed over in an instant. But there were loose ends. Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin, had been under the watch of Jack Ruby, a man with ties to both Marcello and the Chicago outfit. 2 days later, Ruby put a bullet in Oswald on live television, cutting off the chance for him to talk. The message was clear. Some secrets stay buried. And in the years that followed, more lives would be taken to keep them that way. While Marcello's shadow stretched into national headlines, New Orleans itself was a battlefield. District Attorney Jim Garrison launched a crusade against the French Quarter's strip clubs, a campaign dressed up as morality but steeped in politics. His agents raided the Flamingo Club on Bourbon Street, where star dancer Tempest Storm, Gloria DeLone, claimed she was scarred for life by one of Garrison's men. The DA called the clubs dens of prostitution and obscenity. Owners said it was harassment. In court, Assistant DA Dennis Barry tried to tie the club's owner, Frank Cinephile, to Peter Marcello, Carlos's brother. Cinephile admitted borrowing money from Peter, but swore the club was his alone. Garrison didn't stop there. He accused city judges of cutting his budget under mob influence. When they demanded an apology, he sneered, "Apologize? I have nothing to apologize for his raids shut down clubs, embarrassed popular strippers, and hauled beds, teddy bears and lingerie into court as evidence." Behind the noise, the Marcello name surfaced again and again, proof that Carlos's network touched everything from nightclubs to the courthouse itself. The pattern repeated on a bigger stage. Senate hearings exposed corruption inside the Teamsters and the International Union of Operating Engineers. Hoffa, Dioguardi, Tony Ducks Corallo, gangsters using unions as personal banks. 40 hoodlums with hundreds of arrests wormed into labor locals. Hoffa claimed amnesia 111 times when grilled about it. Officials like William Maloney lived like kings off union money, yachts, limousines, mansions, while claiming poverty on their taxes. On Long Island, the de Konings treated Local 138 like a dictatorship, expelling and beating dissenters. Detroit's coverall industry showed how gangsters could strangle an entire business sector. And then came the jukebox racket. From Chicago to Denver, St. Louis to New Jersey, the mob had its hooks in the coin-operated machine business. Witnesses named names: Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Gerardo Catena, Jack Dragnet, and Carlos Marcello. The Senate called it national alarm. The Teamsters were the linchpin, and the mob had them locked down. By May 1963, the Supreme Court refused to review Marcello's deportation case. The Justice Department insisted his 1961 removal to Guatemala had been legal, even though his lawyers called it a kidnapping. When he re-entered the country, they said he broke the law. Marcello stood accused of illegal re-entry, his fate hanging between the courts and the Kennedys' war. But history broke his way. Kennedy died in Dallas. Ruby silenced Oswald. And Carlos Marcello, the man RFK had dragged out of New Orleans, walked free, his power intact, his enemies gone. 1963 closed in on Carlos Marcello like a vice. On May 28th, the Supreme Court refused to touch his case, letting stand the rulings that kept his 1961 Guatemala dump and run on the books and pushed the fight to a pending illegal re-entry trial in Louisiana. He'd been snatched out of New Orleans by immigration agents on April 4th, 1961. He slipped back and surrendered on June 5th. Now Washington wanted a conviction to make the kidnapping look lawful. Marcello read the denial as message and motive. The Justice Department was still coming. By summer, Robert Kennedy leaned on another angle: Italy. Marcello was born in Tunisia, but his parents were Italian, and RFK pressed the Italian embassy to take him. Rome bristled. If America had taught these men the trade, why ship them back? The embassy still sent for papers to prove parentage. The Justice Department framed it as housekeeping. The Italians saw it as dumping garbage at their door. Guatemala hadn't stuck. Maybe Italy would. October 2nd brought a different kind of pressure. Newsday reported a federal dragnet, one of the biggest in U.S. history, built off Joseph Valachi's testimony. A top-secret list, roughly 1,300 names, went to the FBI, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Immigration, IRS, and select locals. The order? A no-quarter campaign. Immigration status, taxes, narcotics, any hook that landed time. The list read like an atlas of the American underworld. New York and New Jersey alone carried 700-plus names: Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Gerardo Catena, Tommy Eboli, Carmine Lombardozzi, Carmine Persico. Long Island names like Thomas Lucchesi, Joseph Magliocco, Sonny Franzesi. New England, Raymond Patriarca and crew. Buffalo, Stefano Magadino. Chicago, Anthony Accardo, Milwaukee Phil, Aldericio, Sam Battaglia, Gus Alex, Jack Cerrone, Rocco Potenzo. Detroit, the Zerillis, Peter Licavoli, Angelo and Vincent Melli. Dallas, Sam Civello and his circle. Kansas City, Nick Civella. Los Angeles, the Dragnet Line, Joe Limandri. Milwaukee, the Balistrieres. New Haven, Vito Sabia and others. Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Jojo Pecora, John Vitale, Anthony Giordano. San Francisco, Jimmy Lanza. And in New Orleans, 3 names: Carlos Marcello, Ralph Amirato, Joseph Pecorabo. The aim was simple: box them in on every statute from harbor law to local vagrancy. Marcello had seen federal zeal before. He also knew what alliances looked like when Washington needed a job done. The same government that now drafted a 1,300-name hit list had once leaned on mob channels to police the docks and help in Sicily. That history didn't protect him now. With deportation off and on the table and a criminal case pending, he kept his head down and his network tight. In New Orleans, his name bubbled up wherever Vice met a license. South Florida told the larger story. Gone were the days when hallways in Hollywood, Florida, echoed with the names on Senate charts. By the early 60s, the lawns were velvet, the hedges precise, and the families clean. But the past hadn't moved. It had gone quiet. Meyer Lansky still kept a place on Hibiscus Drive in Hallandale. Jake Lansky, bodyguards, failing eyesight, bad heart, lived low in Miami Beach. Frank Costello's abandoned dream house sat where civic anger and a tax lien had frozen it. Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo had come and gone. The code held, no killings in Florida, do it when the target goes home. Valachi tied Lansky back to Vito Genovese. Anywhere Meyer is, there's Genovese. It tracked with the paper trail. Kefauver had tagged Meyer in the Big Six with Luciano, Adonis, Moretti, Zwilman and Siegel. In 48, Lansky met Luciano in Italy. Before that, he'd visited him in Sing Sing. Luciano, the man whose wartime cooperation cut a path from prison to deportation, was history by 62. Meyer kept absorbing blows and moving. 90 days for Saratoga gambling in 53, a $250,000 IRS bill paid in 56, hauled as a vagrant in 58 after Anastasia got clipped in a barber chair. Then the real hit. January 8, 1959, Castro booted him from Cuba. The Riviera glitter died overnight. Batista fled with the skim. Jake's operation at the Nacional folded right after. Lansky still had old New Orleans threads. When Costello pushed slot machines south, dandy Phil Castell came to organize. Huey Long's assassination scrambled the political math. A new city regime later shut the racket down. In the middle, as front man, Carlos Marcello. The way the money ran told you who mattered. Louisiana's machines didn't move without a broker, and Marcello was the broker. Jake had his own arc. In 1954, he beat deportation in federal court, then cleaned his sheet to the extent it could be cleaned. $2,000 fines for running the Club Boheme in Hallandale and Green Acres, then a full pardon under acting Governor Charlie Johns. Hollywood's police chief and the Broward sheriff wrote letters vouching for him. They said he'd lived quiet since 1950. On paper, it helped. On the street, everyone knew which Rolodex he could still open. All of this fed back into the 1963 campaign against men like Marcello. Washington ran 2 tracks, courtroom and paperwork. In the courtroom, the government argued illegal re-entry, make a felony out of the way home to New Orleans, and launder the 1961 grab as justified. In paperwork, they worked the consulates and embassies, Italy this time, because if the bench didn't bury him, a plane ticket might. The Italians didn't want him. Tunisia didn't want him. Guatemala hadn't kept him. The Justice Department kept trying. Meanwhile, Valachi's spotlight burned through the unions and rackets that fed the families their cash. The Teamsters were the hinge. Coin-op machines were the fuel. Names from the Newsday list overlapped with everything from jukebox routes to concrete pause. The The point wasn't to prove a grand conspiracy in headlines. It was to win small cases that added up. Immigration 1 week, taxes the next. Obscenity and vagrancy on Friday night raids to keep the pressure local. If a judge balked, there were whispers about influence. If a DA pushed, there were whispers about grandstanding. In New Orleans, it all ran near Marcello. That's how 1963 set the table. The Supreme Court said, no review. The Justice Department said, try Italy. The agencies said, nobody walks. South Florida looked respectable and pretended not to remember who invented the respectability. And in the middle stood Carlos Marcello, on the list, in the courts, under the embassy's magnifying glass, still holding his ground, still connected to the money machines and the men who ran them. The headlines would move on. The pressure wouldn't. From here to the mid-70s, the campaign against organized crime kept widening. Immigration, tax, narcotics, union rackets. Each case another turn of the screw. Marcello's name kept appearing in the places that mattered. The lists, the affidavits, the club ledgers, the whispered testimony. The federal plan was to box him in from every side. His plan was simpler. Survive every round and make sure the House still paid. The Senate cranked up the heat on October 9, 1963. Joe Valachi was peeling back the mob's history on national television, and the country wanted to know why the bosses still walked free. To make the point, columnists reached for the same name. Carlos Marcello, the little man from New Orleans, still here after a decade of deportation tries, still running his territory. Marcello's file read like a civics lesson in how to survive. Picked by Frank Costello at the Black Diamond Club in '47, he tightened his grip through the Beverly Club with Costello and dandy Phil Castile. His sheet began in 1929 with a narcotics count, 1 year and a day. In 1938, immigration said he didn't appear deportable. He later did 5 years of a 9-11 for assault and robbery, and in July 1955, he got a full pardon. After Atlanta, the arrests kept coming, but witnesses in New Orleans kept their mouths shut. He built holdings that looked legitimate on paper: taverns, garages, the Dixie Coin Machine Company, Jefferson Music, B. Robertson Distributing, Fogarty's New Orleans Coin Machine Company. Once his name hit print, Washington moved. Kefauver put him on the committee's board in 1952. By February, deportation proceedings were rolling. Appeals bought him time. The clock ran 3 years to a 1955 Supreme Court ruling: deportable. He still wasn't gone. He kept appealing. 3 trips to the High Court, 3 losses, and kept living in Louisiana. In hearings, he played defense by silence. 115 Fifth Amendments with Kefauver. More than 50 with the Rackets Committee. One column even claimed he remains a citizen of the United States. A neat irony given the government's entire case hinged on the opposite. His edge in the long game was a Washington lawyer who didn't look the part. Jack Wasserman wasn't a backroom shouter. Harvard cum laude, Board of Immigration Appeals alum, Justice Department during the enemy alien program. Judges called him Mr. Immigration. He chaired the ABA's Immigration Committee, charged modest fees, raised money for Jewish charities, went to church socials with his wife Marie. Around him, gangsters behaved. He joked the only strong arm he'd seen came from the government. Wasserman's client list was its own organizational chart: Costello, Russell Bufalino, Big Bill, Lias, Jack Dragnet. Setimo, Big Sam, Accardo skipped $92,000 bail and self-deported to Italy on a narcotics beef. Dragnet woke him at 4 a.m. for an injunction. He died before the case closed. Costello summoned him to the federal pen in Atlanta to argue himself into a county jail on a technicality, and won the transfer to Milan, Michigan. The message was clear: if you couldn't beat the taxman like Capone, you beat deportation with paperwork. For Marcello, Wasserman engineered delay like a craft. After the 1955 High Court loss, he went to Italy for an injunction arguing persecution if Marcello returned. Italy withdrew his passport. The Justice Department had to start over. Meanwhile, alleged Guatemalan birth records surfaced, and the Immigration Service seized on them. In April 1961, agents lifted Marcello off Louisiana soil and flew him, sole passenger, to Guatemala City. "They were under orders not to talk to me," Marcello later said, "but one guy offered me a cup of coffee." He didn't stay. He slipped back through Latin America, reached New Orleans, and with agents on the block and walkie-talkies crackling, met Wasserman at 5 in the morning. He surrendered on the lawyer's terms. By May 1963, the Supreme Court refused to review the deportation snatch. In October, the columnists used Marcello as Exhibit A, while Valachi talked, and the feds vowed a no-quarter campaign. And in New Orleans, the government tried a different front: conspiracy. Judge Herbert W. Christenbury set the tone. On October 10th, he refused to dismiss a separate illegal re-entry indictment. The same day, he denied motions to throw out a conspiracy count, charging Carlos and his brother Joseph with securing a fake Guatemalan birth certificate to block deportation to Italy. Italy had once agreed to take him as an Italian national born in Tunis in 1910, until the Guatemalan record showed up. Now, the certificate itself was the case. Defense asked to move the trial. Too much publicity, they said. You couldn't seat a fair jury in New Orleans. On October 22nd, Christenbury set the hearing. On October 25th, and again on October 28th, he shut them down. No dismissal, no delay, no transfer. Trial would start in his courtroom. Jury selection took 2 days. By November 6th, a panel was sworn, and the defense won a small, tactical victory. A court-ordered psychiatric exam for the government star witness, Carl Irving, also reported as Carl L. Knoll, a co-conspirator with a record the defense called psychopathic. Christenbury heard the experts and Knoll then ruled him competent. No mistrial. When testimony opened, Knoll put a price tag on the fraud. He said he bribed Guatemalan officials to forge the San Jose Pinula ledger, an entry that made Carlos Marcello a native of Guatemala on February 10, 1910. He named names: Eduardo Rodriguez Genis, whom he identified as the Prime Minister, and Antonio Valladares, the partner, supplied the access and the car. Early figures were $350 to $450 for legwork. Later, he told the court he heard bigger numbers: $15,000, then $50,000, up to $100,000, discussed to get the job done. They certainly didn't do it for nothing, he said. He claimed he'd warned federal agents as early as 1959 or 1960 that the certificate was a fake before the 1961 deportation flight. Corroboration trickled in. On November 13th, Mrs. Knoll testified she bought a $100 dress in New Orleans for the Prime Minister's wife, a gift tied to the trips. A former Guatemalan government aide, Marco Giron Arrozola, by then living in Los Angeles, told the court he'd been assigned by Rodriguez Genis to help Knoll in any way possible. The paper itself took a hit from science. FBI handwriting expert William J. Farrell, Jr. compared the San Jose Pinula entry to other page entries and the book at large. His opinion, the Marcello notation didn't match the contemporaneous hand. Even Wasserman conceded that the ledger entry was false. His point was different. A forged document's existence didn't prove his clients conspired to get it. The defense hammered Knoll. They pressed his record, his story shifts, his motives. They tried to air his mental health history from an Ohio facility. Christenbury kept the evidence out after finding him competent. On November 15th, Wasserman filed technical motions. On November 17th, Christenbury denied 2 more defense bids, including a move to dismiss the indictment. The case headed to summations. On November 19th, with closings near, the defense brought in Yvonne Klein of Wilmette, Illinois. She called Noel a con man. She said his Guatemala trips were tied to a $200 million building scheme, not a forged birth certificate. The court also heard an Italian lawyer on how such a certificate would be treated in Italy's system, a narrow point aimed at undercutting the government's theory of obstruction. The government closed on a straight line. Since 1953, Marcello had been under a standing deportation order off a 1938 narcotics conviction. He and his brother obtained a forged Guatemalan birth record in 1956. Italy balked. Guatemala took him in 1961. He re-entered illegally. Now hold the men who rigged the paperwork. The defense closed on credibility and burden. Noel was a swindler whose story moved with the wind. Even the FBI said the entry was fake, but forging ink in a village book didn't prove who paid for the pen. And the government's own timeline was a tangle of bad records and wrong assumptions. The jury didn't take long. On Friday, 2 weeks after the start, 12 New Orleanians filed back into Christenberry's courtroom and cleared both brothers, not guilty on conspiracy. The verdict gutted the centerpiece of the government's case and made its star witness look like what the defense said he was. Marcello still carried the illegal re-entry count and the old deportation order the Supreme Court had let stand. Italy, Tunisia, Guatemala, no one wanted him, and he wasn't leaving. The Senate could rage, Valachi could talk, agencies could circulate lists. In New Orleans, the result was on the board. The little man had taken another punch and stayed on his feet. By the fall of 1963, Carlos Marcello was fighting on two fronts. In court, he had Jack Wasserman, the quiet Washington technician who beat deportations with paperwork and patience. On the street, he had shadows. Guy Bannister, an ex-FBI hand running a private spy shop out of 531 Lafayette, and David Ferry, the oddball pilot who flew Carlos and his brother to Dallas and back, and moved in the same orbit as anti-Castro Cuban exiles and the CIA's cutouts. When Lee Harvey Oswald hit the airwaves as the man in Dallas, Ferry vanished. He resurfaced only when Jim Garrison dragged him into a room and started asking questions. Decades later, Oliver Stone's JFK would turn that tangle into a movie. In New Orleans, it had already played as real life. Marcello's grudge against Robert Kennedy wasn't theater. In 1961, immigration agents lifted him off Louisiana asphalt and dumped him in Guatemala. He clawed back through Latin America, made it home, and took a vow. By October 63, Joe Valachi was reciting the mob's family tree on national TV, and the Justice Department was pushing a no-quarter list of targets. The walls were closing in. That's when Marcello made his most audacious move. On November 22, 1963, John Kennedy was shot in Dallas. In New Orleans, the man RFK had tried to erase, walked out of court stronger than he went in. The cover story wrote itself. Castro did it. The mechanics looked domestic. Marcello's syndicate had friends in Dallas, reach in local politics, working ties to Cuban exiles who blamed the White House for the Bay of Pigs. Operation Northwoods, Pentagon lawyers once gaming out false flag hits to frame Castro, showed how far the hardliners would go. The plan got killed in Washington. The impulse didn't. In the chaos after the shots, witnesses were steered, files were buried, and the narrative locked down around a lone gunman who wasn't going to testify. The old line, "3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead," wasn't philosophy. It was policy. Marcello's own policy was uglier. "We bury our secrets deep down here, motherfucker." He said it like a man describing a job, not making a threat. In the 40s, he'd settled scores the Louisiana way. 2 shots to the back of the head, bodies melted in lye, What was left fed to the swamps. When the target was high profile, he reached for the old trick. Set up a patsy, then erase the patsy. If the patsy slipped the noose, you waited him out, one layer at a time, until the trail died with the witnesses. Garrison wouldn't let it die. Through the mid and late 60s, he chased the Dallas ghosts. Ferry, Bannister, strippers on Bourbon Street who heard too much. John Martino with one foot in Santo Traficante's world. People recanted, disappeared, or turned up dead. Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, Jimmy Hoffa. Different cities, same endings. The message was uniform. Talk, and you won't get to talk again. Then the 70s blew the seal. Watergate pulled on a thread, and out came Old Bay of Pigs' hands in new burglar masks. The CIA's Castro games, poisons, hit teams, mob intermediaries, stopped being rumour and started reading like minutes. In hearing rooms and newsrooms, the same names surfaced: Russell Bufalino, Santo Traficante, Carlos Marcello. The Rockefeller Commission peaked at the CIA. The Church Committee promised to tear the file cabinet open. A governor from the Midwest, not prone to fairy tales, said out loud what people were thinking after Watergate. Maybe the worst case wasn't beyond imagining anymore. Calls went up to reopen Dallas. Former Senator Ralph Yarborough joined them. Even the official commissions admitted they were looking at possible CIA brush-ups against Oswald's life. Back in New Orleans, the ground fight never stopped. On January 7, 1975, the U.S. Attorney hauled Marcello into federal court with Samuel Labruzzo and Peter Brown. The charge sheet was simple and modern. 2 Hobbs Act counts for muscling a majority stake in a métairie club called Crash Landing by choking off interstate liquor, talent, and equipment, and a RICO conspiracy built on the same muscle. 60 years and 45 grand in fines hung over the table if the jury bought it. 20 years after Kefauver called him Louisiana's boss, Marcello was still the name on the first line of the indictment. That same winter, the national lens zoomed in. On March 12, 1975, Senator Frank Church said his committee would dig into allegations of CIA plots against foreign leaders, Castro, Lumumba, others, and hold public hearings by summer. No arm of the U.S. government, he said, had the authority to commit assassination. It sounded like a boundary. After Dallas, it felt like a wish. Reporters started rereading the Warren report with fresh eyes. They found the same odd traffic patterns. Oswald once handing out pro-Castro leaflets at a building tied to Clay Shore. George de Mohrenschildt, the worldly oil engineer, passing trip films to the U.S. government after hiking through Guatemala near CIA staging grounds. And in New Orleans, Guy Bannister's office orbiting anti-Castro Cubans, ammunition crates, and paramilitary talk. Bannister's address book was a study in American extremes. Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front kids walked in one door. George Lincoln Rockwell, the Nazi party boss, knew the way to another. And locals swore Bannister helped Marcello in the deportation war. Around the corner, 544 Camp Street turned up on Oswald's leaflets, a location he never rented, but that sat atop the same ecosystem. Ferry was a regular in Bannister's space. He bragged of torching Cuban cane fields for the government and trading favors with exile leaders. Bannister aides linked him to Maurice Brooks Gatlin Sr., plugged into something called the Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean, close to the 1954 Guatemala coup lane, and, according to Gatlin's bar talk before he fell from a Panama hotel in '64, close enough to move CIA cash to French right-wingers planning to hit de Gaulle. You didn't need to prove Bannister ever stood in a room with Oswald to feel the heat of proximity. In New Orleans in '63, you only had to cross the hall. As the decade turned and the hearings stacked up, Marcello's name kept landing on desks. Bufalinos, too. Traficantes, always. The working theory sharpened. not as a headline but as a map. Mob muscle, Cuban exile zeal, a handful of intelligence operators who saw enemies everywhere, and a local police culture that knew which calls to make and which to miss. The patsy was in place. The cleanup had a schedule. That's how the arc runs from a Guatemalan dump in '61 to a Dallas motorcade in '63, from a Bourbon Street pilot and a Camp Street detective to Senate subpoenas in '75. Through it all, Carlos Marcello stayed the constant, fighting deportations with Wasserman's briefs, protecting territory with the old discipline, and outlasting every dragnet the government could print. And when the flashbulbs popped and the questions turned blunt, did the mob reach into the heart of American politics? The answer was the same as it had been in Louisiana swamps for 30 years. Secrets go deep, and the ground here knows how to keep them. By 1975, Carlos Marcello was still on the board and still collecting wins in places most men never see coming. Washington first. On April 18th, David Bellin, the Warren Commission lawyer, now riding herd on Nelson Rockefeller's CIA review, said the quiet part out loud. The agency hadn't given the commission the full file on its Castro kill games. Bellin fired off letters, demanded every contact with would-be assassins, and warned that anything less than full disclosure poisoned the record. If the CIA had sat on plots abroad in '61, '62, '63, what else had been buried, and by whom, was suddenly fair game. New Orleans next. Marcello's public face in '75 wasn't a card room or a Shylock ledger. It was produced. On May 14th, the Pentagon's procurement pipeline showed over $1.1 million of tomatoes, strawberries and cantaloupes flowing from Pelican Tomato Company, sold, inspected, and shipped to Army, Navy and Air Force bases from Alabama to Panama. The Agriculture Department stamped the goods clean. The law said lowest bidder wins. The Defense Department signed. Federal files said the firm's top salesman drew $1,600 a month and answered to the name Carlos Marcello. On the record, he called himself Pelican's public relations man and advisor. Under oath, he swore he'd never been mafia. The paper trail said otherwise. Kefauver in the 50s, Valachi in the 60s, house crime hearings in the 70s. Pelican's secretary-treasurer, Joseph Matassa, Marcello's co-defendant in a 1965 jury tampering case that ended in acquittal, shrugged at the noise. He is always a gentleman. The government could apply pressure not to buy from mob-tainted companies. The lawyers could sue to stop the blacklists. Meanwhile, the salad bars stayed stocked. Family business bled into city business. On July 1st, Joe Marcello Jr., no criminal record, but Carlos's brother all the same, told regulators he'd served as an official host for State Department dignitaries and wanted liquor licenses for broussards in the French Quarter. He said he'd been afforded the highest compliments and accolades for the role. The State Department's files didn't back him. The City Council denied the license on character and reputation. The message was simple. Your last name is an indictment. The backdrop darkened again overseas. On July 11th, Fidel Castro told reporters, while Jamaica's Michael Manley sat nearby, that he'd lived through 40 to 60 attempts on his life by counter-revolutionaries run by the CIA. He ticked off a 1961 chocolate milkshake poison job that failed when the vial burst in the freezer, and a 1971 plan in Chile to sneak guns in TV cameras. He didn't put the Kennedys' fingerprints on the trigger, but he said the agencies were on the table. He added one more. A confessed CIA organized plot against Deputy Premier Carlos Rafael Rodriguez. After years of denials, the vocabulary was changing. Bellin wanted documents. Castro supplied context. Back in Louisiana, Joe Jr. didn't fold. He appealed. On September 10th, Judge Melvin Duran told the city to issue the permit. The council couldn't rehash the same information year after year. The Vice Squad's hearsay about Joe as an underboss didn't cut it. Joe took the fifth at the hearing, admitted ties to J. Jola Printing, sports information, and denied knowing anything about illegal racing sheets. Duran was blunt. In the quarter, Joe's reputation was established as good. No new evidence, no denial. Thread the pieces, and you see the same pattern Marcello had worked for decades. Fight the government in court with procedure and patience. Keep a hand in legitimate trade where law favors the lowest bidder. Let the family push on doors where rumor does the work of proof. And survive while Washington argues about what its own agencies did and didn't do. In April, a Warren lawyer accused the CIA of hiding murder plots. In May, the Pentagon bought his tomatoes. In July, a brother took a public hit, and by September, won it back from a judge. Carlos Marcello didn't need headlines. He needed the system to keep moving, even when it claimed it wanted him stopped. In 1975, it did exactly that. By 1975, Carlos Marcello was still shaping outcomes in rooms far from the headlines: quiet leverage, steady pressure, and a talent for letting other people take the heat. That spring, Washington cracked first. On April 18th, David Berlin, the Warren Commission lawyer, now riding herd on Nelson Rockefeller's CIA review, said the agency hadn't told the full truth about its Castro kill plots. He demanded every contact with would-be assassins. Full disclosure, no euphemisms. If the CIA sat on murder schemes in 61 to 63, the integrity of every finding around Dallas came into question. For Marcello, it meant the country was finally arguing about the right secrets. A month later, the contradictions got local and ridiculous. The Pentagon's purchasing rules said, lowest bidder wins, and the Agriculture Department said the produce was clean. So Army, Navy, and Air Force kitchens took in more than $1 million worth of tomatoes, strawberries, and cantaloupes from Pelican Tomato Company. On paper, Pelican's $1,600 a month salesman handled the orders. In federal files and 3 decades of hearings, that salesman was identified as Carlos Marcello. He called himself Public Relations and Advisor. His boss, Joseph Matassa, acquitted with Marcello in a 65 jury tampering case, insisted they never do anything with anybody but good people. Justice warned agencies off mob-tainted vendors. Mob lawyers sued to stop the blacklists. The result was the most American compromise imaginable. Washington debated ethics while the mess halls ate. The name still haunted the family. On July 1st, Joe Marcello Jr. told New Orleans he'd been an official host for State Department dignitaries and wanted liquor licenses for broussards in the quarter. The department's files didn't back him. The city council denied the permit on character and reputation. Joe had no record. He had a last name. He appealed, and on September 10th, Judge Melvin Duran ordered the city to issue the license. No new evidence, no more reheated hearsay. In the quarter, the judge said, Joe's reputation is established as good. Abroad, the backdrop turned open book. On July 11th, Fidel Castro, calm, matter of fact, said he'd lived through 40 to 60 CIA-backed attempts on his life, from a 1961 poison milkshake that froze and burst to a 1971 plan to hide guns in TV cameras in Chile. He didn't tag the Kennedys personally. He didn't have to. The architecture was the point. Covert action outsourced to cutouts, including the same crime lords Congress had been naming since Kefauver. Then came 1976, and Marcello's shadow landed somewhere no one was looking for it. A strip of Florida coastline. On January 16th, the Oyster Lake Association sued Walton County and Florida's DOT to stop repairs on State Road 30A until the state fixed a man-made drainage disaster at Dune Allen. At the center was a New Orleans developer named Senna, arrested in 1974 for alleged coastal setback violations. Accused of leveling protective dunes and hacking an artificial streambed, that choked the culvert linking Oyster Lake to the Gulf. Hurricane Eloise and heavy rains finished the job. Flooded homes, septic discharge in the lake, marsh grass clogging ditches, foundations rotting. The state's environmental regulator called it an unsafe condition that will not clear up by itself. Residents said county crews had let the road ditches die, then yanked promised culvert pipes after delivering them. Senna's name drew extra scrutiny because testimony in Louisiana had tied him at distance to Carlos Marcello. The lawsuit wasn't about the mob. It was about water, health, and who pays when a friend of friends moves sand the wrong way. That spring, Rolling Stone ran Howard Cohn's long frame-up of the last 30 years, the war-era deal that yoked federal intelligence to gangsters, and the way that Bond echoed into Cuba, Dallas, and Watergate. The line began in 1942 when naval intelligence cut Operation Underworld with Meyer Lansky to secure the docks and, by proxy, smooth Lucky Luciano's path out of prison. The OSS learned the same lesson in Sicily. After the war, Allen and John Foster Dulles and Governor Thomas Dewey pushed the National Security Act through in 1947, built the CIA, and kept its political oxygen flowing. Young congressmen got help. One of them was Richard Nixon. CIA leaks on Alger Hiss made his name. More pink fodder helped him beat Helen Douglas in 1950. Dewey steered him onto Eisenhower's ticket in 1952. Meanwhile, Lansky modernized the syndicate, banking, hotels, heroin routes through Marseille, while the agency leaned on the same networks abroad for its own ends. By the mid-50s, the circles overlapped in daylight. Howard Hughes, lawyered up with ex-CIA hands, pumped quiet cash into Nixon and got friendly outcomes on antitrust and a tax-exempt foundation. In Cuba, Lansky and Fulgencio Batista built hotel casinos into a $100 million engine until New Year's Day 1959, when Castro took Havana and the Skims fled to Miami and Las Vegas. In Langley, plans were drawn to take the island back. E. Howard Hunt recruited exile brigades for the Bay of Pigs, and, on a parallel track, the CIA retained Robert Maheu to reach out to John Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santo Trafficante for Castro hits, $150,000 authorized and, later, Lyndon Johnson's phrase, "a damn murder incorporated in the Caribbean." The operations went sideways. Kennedy refused air cover at the Bay of Pigs, defused the 62 missile crisis, and in mid-November 1963 told aides the CIA will have to be dealt with. The Church Committee later found that on November 22nd, while Kennedy's emissary opened talks with Castro, the agency greenlit yet another Castro attempt. By nightfall, Dallas had wiped the slate and ended the debate. Cohn's thread ran through Oswald. A Marine with clearance at a CIA-sponsored U-2 base in Japan, a defector to the USSR with a $1,500 ticket and $203 in the bank, a returnee who got his papers back, then a one-man pro-Castro chapter in New Orleans, handing out leaflets stamped with 544 Camp, an address tied to anti-Castro operations. Oswald was seen with David Ferry, who trained exile pilots for the CIA, taught at an anti-Castro camp, and did legal legwork and flight work for Marcello. Late that summer, Ferry phoned a Chicago number linked to a woman who reached Dallas on November 21st and met twice that night with Jack Ruby. After Oswald's arrest, Ferry drove to a Houston ice rink and lived on a payphone. Hours later, Ruby walked into Dallas police headquarters and shot Oswald on live TV. When Jim Garrison charged Ferry in 1967, Ferry died 4 days later of a brain hemorrhage. The same day, his friend and fellow raider Eladio Del Valle was found shot and hatcheted. Garrison said Ferry was about to flip. The case died with him. Ruby's trail predated Dallas by decades. Errands for Frank Nitti in Chicago, union muscle, and a murder he was questioned in, then a 1947 move to Dallas as a Chicago emissary. He visited Lansky's man Louis McWillie in Havana in '58 and again in Vegas in October '63, and worked the phones that month to Paul Dorfman, Irwin Weiner, Barney Baker, names all over the Bureau's index cards. In early 1964, as if to prove nothing ever ends, CIA hands met to sketch a second Cuban try under Hunt's cover. The hitman sent ahead was caught. The plan died on the vine. None of that put Marcello on a witness stand for Dallas. It didn't have to. The template he lived by: use the system where it helps you, subvert it where it won't, keep your distance from the trigger, and let proxies take the fall, fit the era as neatly as a tailored suit. In 1975, a Warren lawyer accused the CIA of hiding murder plots. The Pentagon bought Marcello's tomatoes. A brother lost a liquor license on rumor and won it back on law. In 1976, a Florida neighborhood fought a drainage war made worse by a developer whose name carried New Orleans baggage and whose dunes were already gone. Through it all, one constant. When power needed work done off the books, it reached for the same Rolodex. When courts and councils pushed back, Marcello was ready with a better file and a steadier hand. That was the edge. That was the lesson. And that's how the little man kept winning, even when the case against him was the biggest story in America. By mid-1976, the map of the American South told you everything about Carlos Marcello, without saying his name. Dallas was up for grabs. Tampa was bleeding. And in the Rio Grande Valley, money moved through tomato crates, like water through a levee. Texas first. The state's Organized Crime Prevention Council laid it out on May 13th. Representatives from at least 5 mafia families were circling Dallas, probing rackets and looking for a foothold. No one outfit had the city locked. That made it open territory, dangerous and lucrative. Down south, federal agents were sent into the lower Rio Grande Valley to chase laundering fronts. One of the names already on the books: Pelican Tomato Company. The Texas Attorney General had closed it for failing to register. Ownership traced to 3 men, including Joseph Marcello, Carlos's kin. Under oath, back in 1972, Carlos himself said Pelican threw him about $20,000 a year. Lowest bidder government kitchens and quiet produce houses might seem far from the mob war stories, but the cash flowed the same direction. The council's report added a familiar mix of violence and cover. Dallas suspects skimming a supper club's profits, a Houston doctor marked for an armed robbery, accident because he could ID the thieves, an arrest after a man tried to hire a DPS undercover for the job, the informant who tipped police later murdered. Harris County saw New Orleans and Kansas City figures sniffing around apartment complexes and restaurants. Legit properties as ballast for the dirt. Austin had its own tells, a club traced to a Gulf Coast syndicate hand. A mafia soldier popped on a bank check swindle. The message was that Texas wasn't a single family's domain. It was a corridor, and New Orleans was already in the corridor. Florida showed you the other half of the picture. On June 23rd, after former cop Richard Cloud took 4 bullets, the Tampa Times dropped a 2-month investigation. More than 150 people tied by state and federal investigators to Santo Traficante Jr.'s organization. Nearly 100 businesses used as platforms: bars, restaurants, vending firms, stevedores, laundries, funeral homes, bakeries, cabs, real estate, even law offices. The syndicate's portfolio ran from gambling and pornography to narcotics, cargo theft, arson, extortion, and murder for hire. Federal indictments named names: Franque Diesidur, Traficante's underboss; Victor Manuel Acosta, a cocaine player; plots to kill 5 men, including Cloud. 2 intended targets who lived, bar magnates Jose Manuel Garcia and Cesar Rodriguez, controlled scores of liquor licenses. This wasn't folklore. It was infrastructure. The official line in Tampa had always been denial. A grand jury in '56 found no independent mafia. Another wave of assurances came in '66, and again, almost on cue, just weeks after a federal panel indicted Desidue and 13 others in the Cloud conspiracy. The history said different. In 1950, Kefauver's hearings heard of payoffs and collusion. In 1954, Santos Sr. died, and Junior inherited the seat, formally introduced to the national table at Joe Profaci's family wedding, the Brooklyn Bridge that linked Tampa to New York's power. In '57, Trafficante and Marcello turned up at Appalachian with 70-plus bosses, and in '66 they were the only non-New Yorkers at the quiet follow-up, the Little Appalachian, dining with Carlo Gambino. In March 1975, Marcello spent 2 days in Tampa visiting Henry Trafficante and Lieutenant James Longo. Ed Reed had summed up the arrangement years earlier. Florida's West Coast shared its take and trouble with New Orleans. Together, the two families stitched control across the southern tier. Tampa's roster echoed that reach. The Badami line, Grandfather Angelo, Uncle Cairo, Father Joe, named as Mafia in '63, and a son who beat a counterfeiting case that Cloud had pushed forward. Old fixers like Arturo Velasco. Bookmakers Louis Figueredo Sr. and Jr. Gamblers Eddie Gordo Blanco, Leo Torretta, Ciro Spoto Belluccia. Port hands tied back to Brooklyn's Profaci crew, Harry Fontana at Southport Stevedore, then Salvatore Forte, later indicted for a 6-figure steel theft, while Forte's secretary happened to be the police chief's sister. Even the Detroit Giacalones dipped a toe. Jack V. Giacalone ran home-building firms that sank under liens. And when a statewide grand jury finally said out loud that organized crime was flourishing, local brass shrugged. The same week, federal prosecutors said Cloud was killed to stop his testimony against Joe Badami's son. Put it together, and the pattern is clean. In Texas, New Orleans money and manpower pushed through businesses that looked harmless, and real estate that looked respectable. In Florida, Trafficante's machine, bound by history and convenience to Marcello's, ran deep into the port, the bars, the cops, the courts. When Dallas looked open, multiple families came to stake a corner. When Tampa needed enforcing, hits were planned like invoices. And threading both states, you saw the same New Orleans fingerprints. Pelican tomato on the books in the valley. Visits and joint tables in Tampa. A standing compact to share roots, skim, and cover. That's how Carlos Marcello kept power in 1976. Not just with casinos and envelopes, but with shipping bills, salad contracts, liquor licenses, and a travel bag that could get him from Metairie to Ybor City without leaving a mark. Dallas might be a question of who would plant the flag. Tampa was a reminder of who already had. And along the Gulf, between the farms and the ports, the money that started in New Orleans didn't need an introduction. It just needed a way through. By 1976, Tampa's underworld had changed uniforms. The easy money wasn't the numbers anymore. It was narcotics. Gambling still paid, but heroin and cocaine paid faster, quieter, and with fewer ledgers to seize. The Tampa Times spent 2 months pulling at that thread. What they found tracked with every good cop's hunch. A working syndicate in Tampa, bookmaking, porn distribution, and a dope pipeline, plugged into national families and run out of the Trafficante organization. Bookmaking didn't vanish. It evolved. Bolita gave way to sports. A sandwich shop owner with firm Trafficante ties ran the biggest book on the West Coast, laying off bets on phones tied to odds coming out of Vegas, Cleveland, New York. Another heir apparent, son of an old-line gambler, a convicted bookmaker himself, specialized in football, basketball, baseball. Across the bay, a St. Petersburg chiropractor doubled as a top bookmaker. 5 pari-mutuel venues in the Tampa Bay area took more than $140 million legally in a single year. Investigators said millions more rode the phones to avoid the IRS window at the track. When the Buccaneers kicked off, Miami and Tampa crews would fight for market share. Everyone knew it. The scale wasn't theory. In 1971 to 1972, 6 federal wiretap cases produced 94 indictments and 25 convictions. At the center, Henry, the man, Trafficante. A federal jury needed 11 minutes last June to convict him and 6 others in a sports ring moving more than $100,000 a week, $3,500 worth of bets, in a 1-minute period, the prosecutor told the panel. 8 years. The lesson from Fort Lauderdale up to Dade was simple. No serious bookie freelances. You're on a national line, or you're out of business. Narcotics, though, had taken the top line on the balance sheet. Ed Reed had written that Santo Trafficante Sr. built the base. His son grew it. In 1968, Santo Jr. went to Bangkok and Saigon, documented later by Alfred McCoy, to grease heroin and opium routes through Southeast Asia. McCoy testified Santo traveled with Domenico Nick Furci, then a yellow cab manager, an identified Tampa mafioso since '63. Furci called it a pleasure trip. The testimony said otherwise. By '74, sources had Santo flying regular to Costa Rica, now a staging point for cocaine. Coke was worth more than gold by the ounce. The mafia wasn't watching it pass by. Tampa's link ran through Victor Manuel Acosta and Louis Blackie Lorandi. Miami Federal Court convicted them of moving 22 pounds of cocaine and 5,000 pounds of marijuana. Their co-defendant was Joseph Charles Badami Jr., third generation out of a family the Senate had named in '63. Acosta went on the run, wanted for setting up the murder of ex-Vice Sergeant Richard Cloud, when Cloud's work cut too close to his narcotics line. Lorandi disappeared too. Investigators tied both men to Ricky Crevero's Miami outfit, 156 strong by Metro's count, responsible by spring 1975 for tons of cocaine and marijuana, and conservatively 40 murders. One of Crevero's founders, Charles Norman Christian, bounced Tampa, Miami, Atlanta until his arrest at the Host International Hotel in '74. His lawyer at points, Frank Regano, who also represented Santo. Crevero and Ronald Chandler took first-degree murder convictions. Christian went to federal time on drug charges. A side player, Marianne Cook, ex-Playboy bunny, wife of jewel thief John Cook, caught a coke possession. Her business partner, George DeFice, was indicted in Tampa alongside Acosta and underboss Frank A. Diesidu in a racketeering count that listed the Cloud killing and 4 more attempted hits. The trafficking net wasn't just Acosta and Lorandi. Arturo Velasco, brother of murdered Bolita boss Jimmy, got nailed in South Carolina for a 15,000-pound marijuana load flown by a Tampa pilot in a DC-4. Frank Zambito, 61, a Tampa contemporary, went down with him. Garland Cochran, indicted with them, hid until feds took him at the Causeway Inn in Tampa. Porn ran on a parallel track. Money, distribution, muscle. 2 bodies turned up on April 20th, 1975, Robert Fetch and Paul Shaw, shot with 2 different guns inside Fetch's Florida Avenue newsstand. No robbery. A swapped padlock. The motive sat on the shelves. Fetch ran a chain of adult bookstores. Violence follows the inventory. Up the ladder, Florida Periodicals, Inc., a Tampa warehouse feeding North Florida, was tied on paper to Peachtree News in Atlanta, once owned by Michael Thievis, the Sultan of Smut, whose $100 million porn empire sat in the orbit of New York and New Jersey families. State agents hit warehouses in Fort Lauderdale and Jacksonville in March '76, $250,000 seized in one, a Florida Periodicals truck with $50,000 in the other, and arrested 15. They wanted to raid Tampa's hub the same day, but were told prosecution wouldn't follow. The state attorney's office called it a communication miss. Agents said they were told Tampa wasn't interested in a porn case. The week before, that same office sent a 58-year-old grandmother to jail 6 months for selling obscene books over the counter. Meanwhile, the big warehouse stayed dark and open. At the street level, denials kept coming. Police Chief Charles Otero told anyone who asked there was no organized crime of any major proportions here. Sheriff Malcolm Beard called mafia influence relatively minor. A statewide grand jury said the opposite, gambling rampant, official corruption likely, and the foreman, Carl Margenot, made the trip on November 21st, 1975, to say it on the record. Tampa hadn't brought them a single case. The evidence is too broad that Tampa is active. Otero had already tried to wave that same panel off Tampa in a Tallahassee meeting. No organized gambling here, he said, then found his own car parked at an Ybor City service station when his vice squad raided it. Slips, gear, 2 arrests, and his relative's fingerprint on a betting sheet. Otero cleared him in days. None of this lived in a vacuum. Tampa's network touched New York and New Jersey on the porn side, Miami on the narcotics side, and the old Havana crew on the gambling side. The national families saw Tampa as a hub, not a branch. The Trafficante organization made sure the phones, routes, and lawyers stayed connected. That was the new math. Phones instead of dice, warehouses instead of backrooms, kilos instead of numbers slips. The money got bigger, the murders got quieter, and the people who said it wasn't happening kept saying it, even as the bodies stacked and the wiretaps played. They liked to say the mob had outlived its cliches. By the mid-1970s, the old theatrics were thinning, fewer public hits, fewer brazen bookmaking racks on the corner. The business had moved inside, into boardrooms, procurement bids, trucking firms, and quiet warehouses. Carlos Marcello, the little man from New Orleans, fit the new picture as neatly as anyone. A Sunbelt Don who never needed a billboard. Start with a stranger and a newspaper. Loran Hall, a Long Beach real estate salesman with a past that read like a paperback, sued the National Tatler for $100 million in 1975. The Tatler had printed 2 sensation pieces, tying Hall to a 2-man sniper team that allegedly killed JFK. Hall said he was in Monterey Park the day the shots were fired. He said the stories cost him jobs, church standing, a marriage. He filed the suit in federal court, calling the paper's sourcing, an unnamed ex-CIA operative, a slanderous fantasy. Hall's life, as the papers spelled it out, was useful to conspiracy writers. He'd been in Cuba in 1958, learning weapons with rebels and walking the mountains with Camilo Cienfuegos. He'd been arrested, condemned to die, moved, sprung, and flew out. He went home, drifted through Wichita and Pasadena, then returned to Miami to strike at Castro's lines. Bridge bombings, raids on air bases, the kind of amateur warfare that attracted pushers, speculators, and fringe spies. He knew people who talked about killing a president. He said he overheard a trucking magnate offer $50,000 to anyone who would do it. He told Jim Garrison things that made Garrison write him a letter of vindication. That didn't stop papers from printing his picture beside Oswald's and naming him in lists of shooters, conspirators, Cuban hitmen, and ghost agents. The suit was part reputation salvage, part refusal to be erased into rumor. Hall's story mattered because it threaded through the same neighborhood where Marcello lived and where the old business had learned a new trade. David Ferry moved in those same lines: pilot, oddball, anti-Castro trainer, Marcello's occasional charterman. Ferry showed up in Garrison's casebooks as a connector, to Oswald, to anti-Castro Cubans, to men who liked violence as a policy tool. Ferry died under strange circumstances in 1967, the week Garrison targeted him. The pattern of witnesses collapsing or vanishing would become a constant in every dossier that mentioned Marcello's name. Public skepticism hardened into a civic demand. Letters circulated. David Wemple urged Congress to reopen inquiries into not just Dallas, but the whole string of political shootings, JFK, RFK, MLK, Wallace. He argued not that the FBI or CIA were all guilty, but that splinter elements and off-book contractors had to be investigated. The case for skepticism had weight. Whistleblowers who squealed turned up dead. Ferry, Clay Shaw, John Roselli, Sam Giancana. The roster read like a warning. Anyone who knew too much was at risk. Meanwhile, the old power centers in New York were rearranging themselves. Carlo Gambino died, and the mob's command structure shuffled. Agnello Della Croce, once the underboss who might have resisted Carmine Galenti's ascent, suffered a heart attack and stepped back. Galenti, a man with international drug ties and Sicilian connections, moved to fill the vacuum. He shook hands with the familiar faces, Santo Trafficante of Tampa, Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, the same men who had taken advantage of wartime and Cold War opportunism to build legal-looking empires out of illegal money. That evolution was no accident. The wartime marriages of convenience, Navy intelligence bending to Meyer Lansky to keep the docks safe, OSS deals to smooth Allied landings in Sicily, had, over 3 decades, become a pattern. Intelligence wants deniability, criminals want protection and new markets. The result was an ecosystem where the mailroom of a brokerage house was as important as a union ledger. By the mid-70s, the mob's kids were turning to white-collar graft, Pentagon contracts, corporate fraud, stock scams, labor rackets. The Bureau reshuffled its priorities and began infiltrating where it used to swoop and arrest. Through all that, Marcello stayed regional and relevant. He didn't need to run New York's crime board to matter. Federal watchers called him one of the Sunbelt bosses, a man with hands in gambling, vending, labor, and a string of legitimate fronts. He was the kind of operator who could move product through ports, make friends with a tomato company salesman in the Rio Grande Valley, and spend 2 days in Tampa visiting Trafficante and James Longo without raising a front-page scandal. Relationships mattered more than titles. When Appalachian and the Little Appalachian dinners put men like Marcello and Trafficante on common guest lists, they were cementing roots and sharing favors. When the families shifted from shootings to skimming, the same lines carried the new business. Tampa's papers laid the bottom line out in cold numbers. Gambling still mattered, but narcotics had become the big ticket. Bookmaking moved to phones and off-track markets. Heroin and later cocaine were the real money. Trafficante's reach into Southeast Asia and Costa Rica, threaded through local lieutenants like Victor Acosta and Louis Larandi, showed how local crews plugged into global routes. The porn trade, too, became corporate. Warehouses, distribution fronts, cages of legal protection. And they moved product under the radar, while the authorities argued about decency prosecutions and whether to raid a warehouse or chase a grandmother for selling a magazine at a counter. In that world, a libel suit like Hall's mattered less for the journalist than for the ecosystem it exposed. The more names that turned up in print and in subpoenas, Hall, Ferry, Shaw, Roselli, Giancana, Marcello, the clearer the map became, a coast-to-coast web of fixers, cutouts, and quiet men who could make something disappear. The men at the top were dying off or retiring to Florida. New hands were taking the money and putting it into investments that looked legitimate on paper. Joe N. Gallo, a quiet operator out of Queens, looked as likely as any to be the kind of board chairman who could run the business without needing to fire a shot. The new business of organized crime was to be invisible. Marcello's advantage was practical. He had territory, networks, and a patient lawyer who could turn government files into delays and legal knots. He understood 2 rules everyone else in that world learned the hard way. First, never be the trigger man. Second, don't let your name be the only thing the papers print. When witnesses died, when newspapers sued and politicians demanded hearings, he had already made contingency plans. corporate frontmen, local contractors, churchmen, vendors, a brother to hold a liquor license. The game's surface had changed. The method hadn't. Find the gap in the law, the seam in the bureaucracy, and thread your money through it. By the end of 1976, the headlines had new syllables: Watergate, Church Committee, Panama connections, white-collar thefts. But the old pattern was still legible. When prosecutors and journalists pulled at a thread in Tampa or Dallas or New Orleans, they found the same handwriting. A mixture of violence and paperwork, a few funerals and a lot of invoices, witnesses who knew too much, and business filings that said nothing. Carlos Marcello survived because he lived at the crossroads, small enough to avoid being a national target, big enough to make sure the money kept moving. The country was learning how to name conspiracies and hold hearings. He was learning how to keep a ledger and stay off the witness stand. That, in the end, was the new mobcraft. Less gunplay, more balance sheets, and Marcello was good at both. By 1977, America had stopped taking the official word on faith. The Warren Report read like a closed ledger. The country wanted the missing pages. On February 13th, Channel 9 aired an Italian-made documentary, The Two Kennedys, A European View. It looked at Dallas and the Ambassador Hotel with a foreigner's hard eye, centuries of intrigue behind it, and said out loud what millions were thinking. Coincidence doesn't kill two brothers and Martin Luther King. The film was dated in places, but it did what mattered. It put the camera back on the angles, the smoke off the knoll, the second rifle on a car, Marina's backyard photo, Oswald outside versus upstairs, and asked who controlled the scene, who steered the story. Even in its blunt mistakes, the European cut hit nerves the Commission never calmed. It sketched a map of power: Chicago, New Orleans, Tampa, and stamped Carlos Marcello's name next to Memphis and New Orleans. It dragged in real operators: Sam Giancana, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, and the quiet hands who move cash and witnesses. The thesis leaned Marxist. The production was 4 years old, but the point landed. If the government could plan assassinations overseas, why should the public accept a lone gunman at home? Stateside, Washington made the doubt worse. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was built to reopen the files and stumbled out of the gate. Chairman Henry Gonzalez tried to sack Chief Counsel Richard Sprague. The other 11 members refused. The Attorney General met the chairman. FBI access shut down on a nod. Committee staff who'd been pulling files at Bureau headquarters were told to go home. On the Hill, one of the GOP's top men called the whole performance inept. For the public, it looked like the same old play. Lock the cabinet, keep the receipts out of sight. Still, the new probe pulled threads. On March 31st, committee documents surfaced a fresh witness, a former stripper turned preacher's wife, saying Jack Ruby introduced her to Lee Harvey. Oswald, of the CIA, 2 weeks before the hit, inside Ruby's Dallas club. She said she shot photos near the depository on November 22nd, and 2 men claiming CIA/FBI credentials took her film. It never came back. Staff told members they were chasing other leads too. Parkland records suggesting 4 or 5 fragments pulled from Governor Connolly, not the neat single bullet story. A doctor who thought the wounds didn't match the commission's geometry. And witnesses in Clinton, Louisiana, who placed Oswald, Shaw and Ferry together with anti-Castro Cubans. The staff added the obvious next step: call Marcello. Then the old pattern reappeared on cue. George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's Dallas patron, the man whose household had spotted the scoped rifle before anyone else, was found dead in Palm Beach an hour after learning the committee wanted his testimony. A tape recorder, set to catch a TV show, captured the shotgun blast. He left papers that mentioned Oswald. Miami and West Palm sources whispered he'd done CIA work in Haiti in 1963. Dead men keep secrets. Outside the hearing rooms, the noise grew. Columnists and ex-spooks traded claims. William Colby admitted approval for foreign assassination plots had to come from high up, without saying how high. Frank Sturgis pushed stories of Ruby running guns for Castro, of Ruby and Oswald in a New Orleans motel, of calls to the Cuban consulate and the Russian embassy in Mexico City. Maybe hard fact, maybe cover smoke. Either way, it fed the one conclusion the audience had already reached. Dallas wasn't simple. Thread the pieces and the same names keep showing. Ferry, pilot, trainer, Marcello's sometime man. Dead the week Garrison's people moved on him. Shaw, acquitted, then gone. Giancana and Roselli, tied to CIA Castro murder plots, both murdered when Senate questions loomed. And always, behind the lines, Marcello, cautious, provincial, powerful enough to matter in New Orleans, disciplined enough to stay just outside the blast radius. Even the House staff's private briefing spelled it out. The man held after the killing, and Marcello should both be called. They knew where the corridors ran. Meanwhile, the top of the New York chart was changing. Carlo Gambino was dead. Aniello Della Croce's bad heart took him out of the fight. Carmine Galante pressed for the chair with Sicilian heroin lines and international muscle, taking meetings with the old Sunbelt bosses, Trafficante in Florida, Marcello in Louisiana. The national picture looked less like a single boss of bosses and more like a board. Regional partners, shared routes, mutual insurance. It was the same structure that let a Dallas club owner walk into a jail basement and pull a trigger, then swear he'd never met the man he killed. By early '77, the argument wasn't whether there had been a conspiracy, it was whose. European filmmakers said history. The public said cover-up. Congress said budget. The committee said new leads, and then locked its briefings. And in the background, the old operators kept their habits. Witnesses with leverage were silenced or discredited. Evidence went missing. The official story narrowed to fit what was left on paper. Marcello understood that game because he'd been playing it since the Kennedys tried to airlift him out of the country. He didn't need a podium. He needed time, lawyers, and distance from the trigger. If Oswald was a patsy or a piece, if Ruby was a clean-up tool or a true believer, if Ferry and Shaw were connectors or cutouts, none of it puts Marcello in a photograph. That's the point. He lived 2 steps off camera while the country argued over frames and fragments. So 1977 did what 1963 never did. It turned the lens around. It asked why federal files closed when a committee knocked, why a Dallas doctor's notes didn't match the diagram, why people with direct lines to Oswald kept dying. And it followed the old map. New Orleans to Dallas, Tampa to Miami, Havana to Mexico City, back to the hands that always moved the money. The skeptics weren't chasing shadows. They were tracing a business model. Compartmentalize the shooters, federalize the secrecy, privatize the profit. In that world, a little man could cast a long shadow and never leave a fingerprint. A former stripper, now a preacher's wife, walks into the House Assassinations Committee and drops a live round. 2 weeks before Dallas, Jack Ruby brought a young man into his club and said, "This is Lee Harvey Oswald of the CIA." She says she was on the south side of Elm, facing the knoll, shooting pictures as the motorcade turned. 2 men appeared within 48 hours, 1 CIA, 1 FBI or so they said, and took her film. It never came back. Ruby swore to his grave he didn't know Oswald. The Warren Commission agreed. Her account says they were lying, or someone was lying for them. The staff keeps the name sealed, but doesn't treat her as a crank. They log it with other leads. Parkland's head nurse saying 4 or 5 metal fragments were pulled from Governor Connolly. Hard to square with one pristine bullet. A doctor on duty thought Connolly's wounds didn't fit the single bullet geometry and says Security blocked him from examining the president's body in the emergency room. The committee starts hunting him. Then there's the man detained in the building next to the depository minutes after the shooting, a man with a record and a payroll history a few feet from David Ferry's New Orleans office. He'd worked out of a suite tied to Carlos Marcello's network. He was taken in, then turned loose. Staff note it flatly and move on to witnesses in Clinton, Louisiana, who place Oswald, Ferry, and Clay Shaw together with anti-Castro Cubans. Garrison's old map suddenly looks less like theatre and more like a route. The same week, another blast. March 23rd, Louisville. Mary Baird says her husband, Clifton, a 27-year cop, was offered $500,000 twice to kill Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She says the approach came from fellow officers and several FBI agents. He told her when they married. He told a congressman again this year. He tried to give a tape to James Earl Ray's lawyers and was warned off. Representative Gene Snyder hears him out and calls him sane, credible. Louisville's brass call it preposterous. The committee takes the tape anyway. Strip away the noise and the pattern holds. Ruby and Oswald cross paths before Dallas. Film that might show the knoll disappears into federal hands. A nurse and a doctor undercut the single bullet story. A Marcello-connected hand is detained beside the crime scene and released. Clinton, Louisiana, ties Oswald to Ferry and Shaw, the same orbit Jim Garrison drew 10 years earlier, the same orbit that runs through Marcello's New Orleans. By spring '77, the official story is bleeding from new cuts. The committee keeps the names quiet, but the shape is clear. Ruby's world, Oswald's movements, Parkland's fragments, and a loose end wired to Carlos Marcello's side of the street. Different cities, different cases, JFK in Dallas, King in Memphis, but the through line is the same. People with access, people with badges, people who know how to make evidence vanish and witnesses doubt themselves. And at the center of the southern lane, the little man from Jefferson Parish, always just out of frame while the record gets rewritten. May 1977, Baton Rouge, Louisiana politics and the mob cross paths in broad daylight. Charles Romer, the state's commissioner of administration, is indicted for malfeasance in office. The charge? Steering a fat contract for state employee medical ID cards to Medical Statistics Inc. of Metairie, a firm with family ties to Carlos Marcello. The numbers tell the story. $442,000 to Marcello's people over a $68,000 low bid out of New Jersey. Romer, flanked by Assistant Commissioner Joe Terrell, Administrator Don Wilkinson, and a junior man named Louis Lateef Jr., pleads not guilty and demands a quick trial. His lawyer, Robert Buck Klein-Peter, pushes Judge Elmo Lear to scrap the August court date and move it to June. Lear nods. But the paper trail doesn't end with ID cards. Terrell is already fighting charges: felony theft, perjury, and tax evasion. The grand jury says he lied under oath about a carpet deal rigged for a political ally of the governor. Jesse Jarreau, the carpet man, is indicted too. Wilkinson is dragged in on malfeasance counts tied to the same scam. For the Marcello crew, this is business as usual. Grease the right palms, make the state work for you, and let the low bid rot in the trash. For Romer, the governor's inside man, it's the kind of exposure that can end a career, or worse. By November, the conspiracy trail circles back to Dallas. Frank Sturgis, a Watergate burglar with CIA shadows, is hauled in on harassment charges. The accusation comes from Marita Lorenz, Castro's ex-lover and an informant with her own history in covert ops. She says Sturgis was on the grassy knoll in '63, firing at the president, and that she rode into Dallas with him and Oswald days before the shooting. Sturgis, smirking behind his lawyer, posts bail and claims he's got papers tying Castro to the hit and showing Jack Ruby in Havana 2 months before the assassination. He insists Ruby covered his tracks by silencing Oswald. Loran says she has photos and documents too, but critics call her a hustler chasing a book deal. Still, her story rattles the House Assassinations Committee enough to merit closed-door sessions. And then, January 1978. The past comes alive in New Orleans. The House Assassinations Committee quietly sets up shop there, retracing Jim Garrison's chaotic but dangerous 1967 probe. They request the old witnesses and bring Carlos Marcello himself to Washington. The little man sits under oath and admits something new. He paid David Ferry around the time of the assassination. Not for a getaway flight, he says, but to dig up dirt on a government witness in his immigration case. He swears that on November 22, 1963, he and Ferry were together in the New Orleans federal courthouse. Ferry, the eccentric pilot with wigs, false eyebrows, and a head full of grudges, had been Garrison's linchpin, a man tied to anti-Castro raids, to right-wing exiles, to Oswald himself. Ferry died in '67, found in his apartment with 2 typed suicide notes and a bottle of medicine on the nightstand. Too convenient for some. Garrison was sure Ferry was the pivot in a plot that aimed to frame Castro for Kennedy's death. Now, with Ferry long gone, Marcello plays it careful. Yes, he paid him. No, he wasn't involved in Dallas. But the shape of the picture doesn't change. State contracts funneled to mob-linked firms. Federal witnesses turn up dead. Old pilots who knew too much dropping before they could testify. Ruby, Oswald, Ferry, all brushing shoulders in Marcello's backyard. And when the committee presses, Marcello does what he's always done best: deny, deflect, and let the silence do the work.